he still dreams of the cliff. Not the fall he planned, but the tiger who stopped him. Colonel Ravi Mehta had 3 months to live when he returned to Nagarhole Forest. 68 years old, terminal pancreatic cancer, pain managed by pills he carried in an old ammunition pouch. The irony wasn't lost on him. Decades of combat, and he'd die from cells betraying him from within. The forest looked different than it had 40 years ago. Taller trees, denser undergrowth, paths reclaimed by nature. But the cliff edge remained exactly as he remembered, 30 meters of vertical drop onto rocks that would make it quick, merciful even. He'd planned this return for 6 weeks, since the oncologist said months, not years, and Ravi decided treatment was pointless. Some men deserved to die where they failed, where 3 soldiers under his command had fallen in an ambush on a March morning in 1985 because their lieutenant made a tactical error that cost them everything. Sepoy Amit Sharma, 22, Sepoy Karan Singh, 19, Sepoy Dev Patel, 23. He'd carried their names for 4 decades like stones in his chest. Their families had searched. Bodies were never fully recovered from the jungle terrain. Intelligence reports blamed enemy guerrillas, gave Ravi a commendation for surviving, transferred him to a desk. He'd risen to colonel, retired with honors, married and divorced, lived a life built on the foundation of 3 boys who didn't. The guilt had calcified into something terminal itself. When the cancer came, Ravi refused chemotherapy. This was his exit point. The cliff where his unit had been pinned down, where he'd made the wrong call about enemy positions, where everything ended. He reached the cliff edge at sunrise. The forest below was wrapped in mist, beautiful in a way that felt like mockery. He removed his service pistol, insurance, in case the fall wasn't enough, and set it on the ground beside him. That's when the Tigress appeared. She materialized from the forest like she'd been waiting. 3 meters away, directly between Ravi and the cliff edge, not stalking, not hunting, standing, watching him with amber eyes that held no fear, no aggression, just presence. Ravi froze. 40 years since he'd seen a tiger in the wild. This one was massive, maybe 180 kilograms, distinctive black stripes against orange that seemed to absorb the early light. Female, based on facial structure. Prime age, healthy, powerful. His tactical mind processed threat assessment automatically. No cover, no weapon in hand, physically weakened. If she charged, he was dead. But she didn't charge. She stood between him and the edge, weight distributed evenly, tail still, blocking his path. When Ravi took a step to go around her, she moved, mirrored his motion, maintained position between him and the drop. He tried the other direction. She blocked again. His throat tightened. 40 years of military training, and a tiger was giving him orders. They stood in standoff for 5 minutes. Ravi's heart hammered. The Tigress watched him with what he could only describe as assessment, like she was reading him, measuring something beyond physical threat. Then she did something that made his scalp prickle. She turned her head deliberately toward the forest interior, looked back at him, and waited. The body language was unmistakable. "Follow me." "No," Ravi said aloud, his voice cracked from disuse and disbelief. "I came here for a reason." The Tigress didn't move, just kept her gaze locked on him, then toward the forest, then back, patient, insistent. "I'm dying anyway," he told her, as if predators understood terminal diagnoses. 3 months, less maybe. Let me do this my way." She took 3 steps away from the cliff, stopped, looked back. The message was clear as any hand signal he'd ever given in combat. "Come with me, now." Ravi didn't move. The Tigress sat down. She was going to wait him out. 10 minutes passed. 15. The sun climbed higher. Ravi's legs began to ache. Cancer had weakened his bones, made standing painful. The tigress remained utterly still, watching him like a soldier on guard duty. Finally, inexplicably, Ravi heard himself say, "Fine. Show me whatever you think is important, then I come back here." The tigress rose the moment he spoke, as if she'd understood. Impossible, but she moved immediately, walking away from the cliff with purpose. Every 20 meters she stopped, turned, verified he was following. 3 decades commanding men, now taking orders from a predator who weighed less than his lost soldiers combined. They walked for 20 minutes into jungle that felt familiar and foreign at once. Ravi recognized the general area. They'd patrolled these sectors in '85. But the paths were gone, landmarks transformed by 4 decades of growth. The tigress moved with absolute certainty. This wasn't exploration or wandering. She knew exactly where she was going. Her paws found firm ground through mud, avoided hidden roots that would trip him, chose routes that accommodated his slower human pace. Ravi's medical training had taught him about animal behavior, fight, flight, territorial aggression. Nothing in that framework explained what was happening. Tigers avoided humans. They didn't block suicides and then played tour guide through restricted forest. Yet here he was, following orange and black stripes deeper into territory where tourists never ventured, where park rangers traveled in pairs, where a dying man probably shouldn't go. She stopped every 20 meters, looked back, waited for him to close the distance. When he stumbled over exposed roots, she paused until he recovered his footing. When his breathing became labored, she sat and gave him time to rest. The cancer had eaten his endurance. 6 months ago, he could hike 15 kilometers without thought. Now, 20 minutes left him, winded, legs trembling. The tigress seemed to understand. She adjusted her pace to match his weakness, showed patience that felt distinctly unnatural for an apex predator. "Where are you taking me?" Ravi asked between gasps for air. "Talking to tigers." The cancer must have spread to his brain. She glanced back at his voice, amber eyes meeting his for a moment, then continued forward. The forest grew denser. Canopy blocked the rising sun, dropped the temperature 10 degrees. Moisture clung to everything, leaves, bark, Ravi's shirt. His phone showed no signal this deep. If something happened to him here, no one would know. His lawyer had instructions for after he didn't return from this trip. No one was looking for him. The tigress led him through a section where the ground dropped sharply to the left. One misstep and he'd tumble 15 meters down a ravine. She walked the narrow path with casual grace, but paused frequently, making sure he navigated safely. When a section looked particularly treacherous, she positioned herself on the downhill side, creating a living barrier between him and the drop. Ravi's hands shook, not from exertion, from the impossibility of what he was witnessing. This wasn't instinct. This was calculated protection. She was guarding him. "I don't understand," he whispered. "Why do you care if I fall?" The tigress made a sound low in her throat, not a growl, something softer, acknowledgement maybe. She continued forward. They crossed a dried stream bed, climbed a slight rise. The vegetation changed, older growth, trees that predated the modern park system. This was primary forest, untouched by human management. Sacred ground, in a way, or haunted ground. Ravi's chest tightened with recognition he couldn't quite place. Something about this area pulled at memories 40 years old. Had they patrolled here? The landmarks were gone, but the feeling remained, dread mixed with familiarity. The tigress's pace changed, more deliberate, almost ceremonial. She was bringing him to something specific, something important enough to stop a suicide and lead a dying man through kilometers of jungle. 20 minutes into forest that felt familiar and foreign at once. Then she stopped at a clearing that made his blood freeze. The space was small, maybe 5 meters across, choked with secondary growth. But even before he looked closer, Ravi knew, his body knew, this place held violence. The tigress sat at the clearing's edge, watching him, waiting for him to see what she'd brought him to see. Ravi stepped forward on legs that threatened to buckle, knelt in the disturbed earth, brushed away decomposed leaves with shaking hands. Metal glinted in filtered sunlight. His breath stopped. Ammunition casings, dozens of them corroded by 40 years of monsoons, but still identifiable, still telling their story. He picked one up with trembling fingers, turned it over, 7.6, 2 by 39 millimeter. AK-47 rounds. Enemy caliber, not Indian military issue. The world tilted sideways. Ravi's hands shook as he cleared more ground. The casings were scattered in a defensive pattern, not random drops from fleeing soldiers, but spent rounds from a fortified position. Someone had fired dozens of shots from this exact location. His mind raced backward through 40 years. The ambush happened at 0630 hours. His unit of 12 men had been advancing through the valley below, following intelligence that placed enemy guerrillas 2 kilometers south. The attack came from above and behind, devastating, coordinated. 3 men killed in the first volley, 2 more critically wounded. Ravi had ordered retreat, called for air support, dragged 2 wounded soldiers to cover himself. The official report praised his quick thinking under fire, awarded him a medal, recommended him for promotion, but the intelligence was wrong. He uncovered more casings, each one a small damnation. The enemy hadn't been 2 kilometers south. They'd been right here, elevated with perfect sightlines to the valley approach. His unit had walked into a killing zone because someone, intelligence division, command structure, bureaucratic failure, had given them false information. His tactics weren't flawed. He hadn't made a fatal error in judgment. The mission parameters were based on lies or incompetence somewhere up the chain of command. 40 years of carrying guilt for a mistake he didn't make. The metal casing felt impossibly heavy in his palm. Physical proof of what should have been obvious. You can't defend against threats you don't know exist. His 3 soldiers died because someone else failed, and Ravi had spent 4 decades believing their blood was on his hands. He looked up at the tigress. She sat 15 meters away, perfectly still, watching him with those amber eyes that seemed to understand too much. How did she know this clearing existed? How did she know it mattered? How long have you known about this place? His voice broke. How did you know I needed to see it? The tigress blinked slowly, made a low sound in her throat, not aggressive, something closer to acknowledgement. She'd been here before, multiple times probably. Her territory must include this section of forest. She'd walked past these human artifacts, absorbed their presence, filed them away in whatever cognitive map tigers carry. But that didn't explain why she'd connected this location to a suicidal man at a cliff edge. That required understanding cause and effect across time, required recognizing human distress and identifying a solution, required something approaching empathy. Ravi pulled out his phone. Still no signal, but the camera worked. He photographed everything, casings, their positions, the clearing's relationship to the valley below, GPS coordinates saved automatically, evidence, proof, documentation that his unit had been ambushed from a position intelligence never reported. This wouldn't bring his soldiers back, wouldn't erase 40 years of nightmares, but it shifted the weight. The failure wasn't his. The guilt he'd carried like stones in his chest was built on incomplete information, and institutional incompetence. He sat back on his heels, overcome. The forest sounds filtered through his shock, birds, insects, wind through leaves. Alive, vibrant, indifferent to human failures and human absolutions alike. Except for the tigress. She wasn't indifferent. She'd brought him here deliberately. "Thank you," Ravi whispered. Inadequate words for an impossible gift. The tigress rose, stretched, looked directly at him with an intensity that made his breath catch. Then she turned and began walking deeper into the forest. He understood immediately. There was more. She wasn't finished. Ravi struggled to his feet. His legs protested, cancer pain flaring in his bones. He'd been walking for over an hour on a body that was actively dying. But he followed. Whatever else she needed to show him, he would witness. The tigress led him away from the clearing, choosing a path that paralleled the valley below. Same elevation, same tactical advantage the enemy had used. After 10 minutes, she veered left, moving with that same purposeful certainty. She was navigating to something specific. Another location in her mental map that connected somehow to the first. Ravi's heart hammered. Not from exertion, from dawning understanding that sent chills down his spine. The tigress wasn't showing him random locations. She was building a narrative, taking him through a sequence that meant something. After 20 more minutes, she stopped, looked back at him, then pawed gently at the ground near a small tree. Ravi approached slowly, dreading what he would find. The earth there was slightly raised, unnatural, deliberate. He knelt and began to dig with his hands. 3 inches down, his fingers found fabric, corroded, half decomposed, but unmistakably military issue. 10 inches down, he found bone. 15 inches down, he found metal that made him weep. Dog tags, corroded but legible. Sepoy Amit Sharma, blood type B positive, Hindu. Ravi made a sound between sob and gasp, his vision blurred. The dog tags trembled in his hands, metal that had rested against Amit's chest for 22 years of life, then pressed into earth for 40 years of death. Amit Sharma, the youngest in his family, 3 sisters who adored him, a mother who'd searched the forest for 2 years, hiring guides, bribing officials, refusing to believe her son was gone without proof. She died in 2012, still wondering where he lay. Still lighting candles for a boy who had no grave. His daughter, Priya, had been 5 years old when Amit disappeared. She was 47 now, a doctor in Mumbai, married with children who'd never met their grandfather. Ravi had attended Amit's memorial service, stood silent, while Priya asked him where her father was, if he'd suffered, if anyone had been with him at the end. Ravi hadn't known. The battle chaos, the retreat, the bodies left behind. He'd filed reports listing Amit as MIA, presumed KIA, remains unrecovered, clinical language for catastrophic failure. Now he knew. Now he could tell her. He photographed everything with shaking hands. The location, the remains, the dog tags from multiple angles, GPS coordinates locked. Evidence that Amit hadn't been forgotten, hadn't decomposed alone in anonymous jungle. Someone could recover him now, give him proper burial, give Priya a grave to visit. The tigress had moved 20 meters away, giving him privacy for his grief. She lay down in the dappled shade, head up, watching, making soft vocalizations while he worked, low sounds in her chest that weren't threatening, something closer to witness. To vigil. "How did you know?" Ravi asked her through tears. "How did you know I needed to find him?" She didn't answer, of course, but her eyes held that same intensity, that same impossible appearance of understanding. Ravi carefully reburied the remains, He had no means to transport them, and disturbing a site like this required official channels, but he marked the location with his jacket tied to a branch, flagging it for return. Ormeet deserved better than 40 more years in unmarked earth. He held the dog tags against his chest, metal warmed by his body heat, cooled by decades of mountain earth. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry I didn't find you sooner. I'm sorry your mother died not knowing. I'm sorry Priya grew up wondering." The words felt inadequate. 40 years inadequate. The tigress rose, stretched with feline grace that seemed impossible given the gravity of what Ravi had just discovered. She looked at him with those amber eyes that seemed to see 40 years of grief, 40 years of guilt, 40 years of questions finally answered. Then she turned toward deeper forest. Ravi's breath caught. There was more. God help him, there was more. He struggled to his feet, legs barely supporting him. The cancer pain had become white noise beneath the emotional devastation. His body was shutting down, but his mind was hyper-focused. Whatever else she needed to show him, he would witness. The tigress led him another half-kilometer through terrain that grew increasingly difficult, steeper grades, denser vegetation, paths that hadn't seen human feet in decades. She moved with that same purposeful certainty, navigating to something specific in her cognitive map. After 20 minutes, she stopped at what appeared to be just another section of overgrown forest. Nothing visibly different, no landmarks. But she approached a cluster of vines covering something at the base of a massive teak tree. She pawed gently at the vines, looked at Ravi, waited. He approached slowly, dreading and needing to see what she'd found. He pulled away the vines with trembling hands, decades of growth reluctant to release its secret. Behind the vines, a carved stone, roughly 1 meter tall, clearly placed by human hands. Someone had etched words into the rock face with painstaking care. Ravi's vision swam as he read, Sepoy Amit Sharma, Sepoy Karan Singh, Sepoy Dev Patel. Below the names, a date, April 1986. 1 year after the ambush, and words in Hindi that broke him completely. Brave soldiers, honored, dead. Forest remembers. Someone had found them, all 3 of them. Someone had cared enough to create a memorial, to mark their sacrifice, to say their names when the army couldn't recover them. Ravi collapsed to his knees, pressing his forehead against the stone. He couldn't breathe through the sobs. Someone had honored them. Someone had refused to let them disappear into anonymous jungle. Someone had given them dignity. The tigress approached closer than before, within 8 meters. She placed her paw deliberately on the ground near the stone, held Ravi's gaze for a long moment. Then she backed away, creating space for him to be alone with his men. She understood. Somehow, impossibly, she understood what this place meant. Ravi traced their names with shaking fingers. The stone was rough under his touch, weathered by 40 monsoons, but still legible. Someone had carved these letters with care, with reverence. Someone had refused to let 3 soldiers disappear into anonymous jungle. He pulled out his phone, photographed the memorial from every angle, the carved names, the date, the Hindi inscription that translated to a promise. Forest remembers. Who had done this? Who had found 3 bodies in hostile territory 1 year after an ambush and decided they deserved honor? Later, when he could think clearly enough to file reports, make inquiries, push through bureaucratic channels, he would learn the answer. Park records from 1986 mentioned a tribal elder named Gopal who'd reported finding remains of soldiers near the northern boundary. Gopal had created this memorial with his own hands, tended it until his death in 2023 at age 91. Gopal had reported the location to forest authorities, to police, to anyone who would listen. But paperwork was lost in channels, Files were misfiled. The recovery operation was never authorized. The memorial stood alone in the forest for 37 years, visited only by animals and one old man who believed the dead deserved dignity, regardless of bureaucratic failure. And now somehow by a tigress who'd absorbed the significance of this human place. Ravi pressed his palms flat against the stone, as if he could feel his soldiers through rock and time. "I found you," he whispered. "Amit Karan, Dev, I finally found you. Your families will know. You'll have proper burial, military honors, your names on the memorial wall in Delhi where they should have been 40 years ago." The words felt inadequate. Everything felt inadequate next to 40 years of absence. The tigress watched from her position 8 meters away, patient, respectful, giving him space to grieve and heal simultaneously. Her amber eyes held that same intensity, that same impossible appearance of understanding. Ravi looked at her through blurred vision. "How did you know?" His voice broke. "How did you know what this meant to me?" She made that low sound again, soft vocalization from deep in her chest. Not a growl, not aggressive. Something closer to acknowledgement, to witness. The sun had climbed higher. Hours had passed since he'd stood at that cliff edge planning his death. Now he sat in front of a memorial to 3 men whose deaths had defined his life, and somehow, impossibly, his guilt was shifting into something else. Not absolution exactly, but understanding, context, truth. His tactical error hadn't killed them. Intelligence failure had, and even that failure couldn't erase what they'd been. Brave young men serving their country, honored by a tribal elder who knew nothing about military protocol, but everything about human dignity. The tigress rose, stretched. The movement was graceful, powerful, reminded Ravi that she was an apex predator who could kill him in seconds if she chose. Instead, she'd chosen something else entirely. She began walking again, but this time her direction was different. Back toward civilization, toward the forest edge. She was leading him out. Ravi struggled to his feet. His entire body ached. Cancer pain, exhaustion, emotional devastation, layered on physical collapse. But he followed. She'd given him everything he didn't know he needed. The least he could do was trust her guidance home. The journey back took nearly 2 hours. The tigress maintained visibility ahead, checking frequently that he was keeping pace. When he stumbled, she waited. When his breathing became labored, she slowed. When they encountered a wild elephant blocking the path, she positioned herself between Ravi and danger until the elephant moved on. She was escorting him, protecting him. Mission command: get this human to safety. She was better at it than he'd ever been as a lieutenant. She hadn't lost a single soldier today. She'd found 3. They passed a stream and she stopped, allowing him to drink and rest. She drank downstream, maintaining distance, but not disappearing. When he was ready, she resumed the journey. Ravi's mind reeled with everything he'd witnessed. The enemy position that explained the ambush. Amit's remains that could finally give his family closure. The memorial that proved his soldiers hadn't been forgotten. And through it all, a tigress demonstrating cognitive abilities that shouldn't exist: spatial memory, emotional recognition, purposeful navigation toward abstract goals. Recording this story, I realized some encounters change everything. We think we know about consciousness in the wild. If you believe animals can understand suffering, subscribe to this channel. Some truths can't be explained, only witnessed. The forest edge appeared suddenly. Civilization. Road. The boundary between her world and his. The tigress stopped where jungle met pavement. She sat, wouldn't cross into the open. This was goodbye. Ravi turned to face her fully. Knelt on the pavement where forest met road, brought himself to eye level with the tigress who'd saved his life in ways he was still processing. She sat perfectly still, tail wrapped around her paws, watching him with those amber eyes. Between them was perhaps 3 meters of space and an impossible cognitive gap. She was Panthera tigris, apex predator, solitary hunter, governed by instinct and territory. He was Homo sapiens, rational being, prone to depression and guilt and suicidal despair. Except everything he'd witnessed today suggested that gap wasn't as wide as science claimed. The tigress had recognized his distress at the cliff edge. She'd physically intervened, blocked his path, refused to let him proceed toward self-destruction. That alone suggested assessment of human emotional state and judgment that suicide was incorrect action. But she hadn't stopped there. She'd led him to 3 specific locations in precise sequence: enemy position that explained tactical failure, soldiers' remains that provided closure, memorial that proved honor. Each location built on the previous, creating a narrative of absolution. That required spatial memory across her territory, yes, tigers were known for that. But it also required understanding that these human artifacts connected to his emotional state, that seeing them would heal something broken in him. How did a tiger make that cognitive leap? How did she connect a suicidal man at point A with evidence at points B, C, and D that would eliminate his reason for suicide? Ravi had commanded men for 30 years. He understood strategic thinking, tactical planning, mission execution. The tigress had just demonstrated all 3. She'd identified a problem, distressed human. She'd formulated a solution, show him evidence that changes his understanding. She'd executed the mission, lead him to 3 locations in sequence that build to psychological transformation. That wasn't instinct, that was cognition. Recent research suggested tigers possessed sophisticated spatial memory, could learn through observation, demonstrated problem-solving abilities that indicated advanced intelligence. Some studies even suggested capacity for empathy, recognizing emotional states in others and responding with what appeared to be compassion. Ravi had read none of that research. He'd spent 40 years believing tigers were magnificent but fundamentally simple: eat, sleep, breed, defend territory. Beautiful machines running on biological programming. The tigress watching him now had just demolished that assumption. She demonstrated memory spanning multiple locations, recognition of human emotional distress, judgment that intervention was necessary, strategic planning toward an abstract goal, healing, and execution that required maintaining focus on that goal for over 4 hours. "Why did you help me?" Ravi asked softly. His voice was hoarse from crying, from exhaustion, from awe. "You're an apex predator. I'm nothing to you. Why did you care if I lived or died?" The tigress made that low, chuffing sound again. Her ears were forward, body relaxed, non-threatening, almost gentle. Maybe she'd observed humans before. Her territory included that memorial. Park records would later confirm she'd been photographed near it dozens of times over 3 years. Maybe she'd seen other humans pause at the stone, exhibit emotional behavior, leave offerings. Maybe she'd learned that location held significance for the 2-legged species that shared her forest. Maybe when she saw Ravi at the cliff, exhibiting obvious distress, some part of her cognitive map connected distressed human plus significant location, potential solution. Or maybe it was simpler and more profound than that. Maybe she recognized suffering. Maybe suffering transcends species, speaks a language that doesn't require words. Maybe she looked at a dying man preparing to jump and felt something close to what humans call compassion. Ravi would never know for certain. Neither would the wildlife biologists he'd eventually consult, who would review his evidence with fascination and skepticism. The cognitive abilities of tigers were still being discovered, still being debated. What Ravi had witnessed was at the edge of documented behavior, perhaps beyond it. But he knew what he'd experienced. A tiger had assessed his emotional state, made a judgment call, formulated a plan, and executed a 4-hour mission to provide him with evidence that would eliminate his suicidal ideation. She'd saved his life not by attacking, but by showing him truth he couldn't have found alone. "Thank you," he whispered, inadequate words for an impossible gift. "Thank you for seeing me, for caring, for showing me what I needed to see." The tigress held his gaze for a long moment. Then she made that soft, chuffing sound one final time, almost like acknowledgement, almost like goodbye. She rose, stretched with feline grace, dipped her head slightly in what Ravi's exhausted, overwhelmed brain interpreted as a salute between soldiers who'd completed a difficult mission together. Then she turned and walked into the forest. 5 steps and the jungle swallowed her orange and black stripes. 10 steps and she was gone completely, melted into green shadow like she'd never existed. Ravi knelt on that pavement for 20 minutes, staring at the spot where she'd vanished. His phone had signal now. He could call for extraction, file his reports, begin the process of recovering his soldiers' remains. But first, he needed to sit with what had just happened, needed to process that a tiger, a supposedly simple creature governed by instinct, had just demonstrated wisdom that surpassed most humans he'd known. She'd seen suffering and chosen to help. Across species, across the vast cognitive divide, she'd chosen mercy. Ravi eventually stood, joints protesting, and pulled out his phone. Full signal now, the modern world flooding back, cellular towers, satellite connections, bureaucratic channels waiting to be navigated. He called the park ranger station first, explained he'd found evidence related to military operations from 1985, human remains, a memorial. He needed recovery teams, forensic specialists, official documentation. The ranger on duty sounded skeptical until Ravi gave his credentials: colonel, retired, service number, security clearance that still carried weight. The machinery of bureaucracy began turning. Recovery would take weeks to authorize, coordinate, execute. But it would happen. His soldiers would finally come home. Next, he called Priya Sharma, Amit's daughter. She answered on the 3rd ring, voice cautious. She didn't recognize the number. "Ms. Sharma, my name is Ravi Mehta. I served with your father." Silence. "Then Colonel Mehta?" Her voice cracked. "You were his commanding officer." "I was." Past tense, heavy with history. "I have news. I found him, Priya. I found your father." The sound she made wasn't quite a sob, wasn't quite a gasp. 42 years of waiting compressed into one broken breath. Where? Nagarhole Forest, there's a memorial. Someone honored him, honored all 3 of them. I have his dog tags, GPS coordinates. He's been there all along, and now we can bring him home. Priya wept openly. Ravi heard other voices in the background. Her asking someone to take the children to another room. Please, she needed a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was steadier, but thick with emotion. "My grandmother died wondering. My whole life, we didn't know. I'm so sorry it took this long." "How did you find him? After all these years, how?" Ravi looked at the forest edge, where the tigress had disappeared. How could he explain? How could he tell this grieving daughter that her father was discovered because a tiger led a suicidal colonel through the jungle on a mission of mercy? "I had help," he said finally. "Unexpected help. I'll tell you everything when we meet." They talked for 20 more minutes. Logistics, coordinates, recovery procedures. When to expect official notification. Ravi promised to attend the burial, to speak at the service, to finally give Priya the closure her grandmother never received. After they hung up, he made 2 more calls, to Karan Singh's elderly father, to Dev Patel's sister. Same conversation, same tears, same decades of waiting finally ending. All 3 families would have answers now. All 3 soldiers would have proper military funerals. Ravi sat on a roadside stone, exhausted beyond measure. The cancer pain had returned with vengeance. He'd pushed his dying body too hard, walked too far, felt too much. His medication was back at the rental car, parked at the cliff trailhead, 3 kilometers away. But he was alive. That was the staggering part. 6 hours ago, he'd been preparing to jump. Now he was coordinating recovery operations and calling families with impossible news. A tiger had done that, had seen him at his lowest point, and made a choice not just to prevent suicide, but to heal the wound that caused it. Research on tiger cognition suggested they possessed remarkable spatial memory, could remember locations across their territory with precision. Studies showed they could learn through observation, problem-solve in novel situations, even demonstrate what researchers cautiously called empathy, recognizing emotional states in others. But what Ravi had experienced went beyond published studies. The Tigress hadn't just remembered locations, she'd connected abstract concepts, human distress, historical evidence, emotional healing. She'd formulated a plan with a psychological goal and executed it across 4 hours of active guidance. That suggested consciousness operating at levels science was only beginning to acknowledge. Not human consciousness, something different but equally complex. A tiger understanding suffering through her own framework, responding with her own version of compassion. Ravi thought about Gopal, the tribal elder who'd created that memorial. Gopal had understood something fundamental, that honoring the dead mattered regardless of species, nationality, or bureaucratic recognition. He'd carved those names because it was right. The Tigress had absorbed that lesson somehow. Walking past the memorial repeatedly, she'd learned its significance. Maybe she'd seen Gopal tending it. Maybe she'd watched other humans pause there, exhibit reverence. Maybe she'd built a cognitive map that included not just physical locations, but their emotional meaning to another species. When she encountered Ravi at that cliff, distressed, preparing for violence against himself, some part of her recognized an opportunity. She could connect this suffering human to the healing location. She could guide him there, show him evidence, give him what he needed. Whether that was sophisticated problem-solving or something closer to wisdom, Ravi couldn't say. But he knew what it felt like being seen by something that understood suffering transcends species. Like being judged worthy of help by a predator who had no biological reason to care. He stood slowly, every joint protesting, began the long walk back to his car. The forest beside him was alive with sound, birds calling, insects buzzing, the rustle of unseen animals in undergrowth, vibrant, indifferent to human drama, except for one tigress who'd chosen otherwise, who'd seen a man in pain and decided intervention mattered more than indifference. Ravi would begin chemotherapy next week, would fight the cancer he'd been ready to surrender to, would live long enough to see his soldiers properly buried, to establish protection for the Tigress's territory, to tell this story to anyone who'd listen. She'd given him that, not just life, but reason to live. 6 months passed like a dream punctuated by medical appointments and military bureaucracy. The chemotherapy made Ravi violently ill for the first 3 weeks. His oncologist adjusted the protocol, found a combination that his body tolerated marginally better. The cancer fought back with savage determination, but so did Ravi. For the first time in years, he had reason to fight. The remains were recovered in early September. Forensic teams spent 4 days documenting the site, photographing everything, treating 3 soldiers with the reverence they deserved. DNA analysis confirmed identities: Sepoy Amit Sharma, Sepoy Karan Singh, Sepoy Dev Patel. All 3 boys finally coming home. Ravi attended each funeral. Military honors, flag-draped coffins, 21 gun salutes that echoed across graveyards where families had waited 42 years for closure. He stood in uniform, thinner now from cancer and treatment, but standing, and spoke about 3 brave young men who'd served their country with honor. Priya Sharma hugged him after her father's burial, weeping against his chest. "Thank you for finding him. Thank you for not giving up." Ravi didn't tell her he'd been seconds from giving up permanently. Didn't tell her about the cliff edge and the service pistol and the plan to join her father in death. Some truths were too complicated for graveside conversations. But he did tell her about the Tigress, about being led through jungle, about the 3 locations, about amber eyes that seemed to understand suffering across species boundaries. Priya listened with the careful attention of someone deciding whether to believe an impossible story. "She saved you," Priya said finally. "So she could save my father, so we could have this." She touched the gravestone, fresh carved marble, with her father's name finally in its proper place. "Yes," Ravi agreed, because that was the simplest truth available. The oncologist called in October with news that felt like a miracle. The tumors were shrinking. Not gone. Pancreatic cancer was rarely so kind, but smaller, stable. The treatment was working beyond expectations. Ravi might have a year, maybe more. He wept on the phone, not from relief, from the weight of being given back time he'd been prepared to waste. The Tigress had saved him twice, once at the cliff, once by giving him reason to fight the cancer. In November, Ravi returned to Nagarhole with all 3 families, 22 people standing at Gopal's memorial stone, which park authorities had now officially recognized and protected. They placed flowers, conducted prayers, stood together in the forest where their soldiers had fallen and been honored by a stranger who knew the dead deserved dignity. It was there, as afternoon light filtered through canopy leaves, that the Tigress appeared. She materialized from the forest like she'd been waiting. Same distinctive stripe pattern, same powerful grace, same amber eyes. She sat at the clearing's edge, perhaps 20 meters distant, and watched the gathered humans with calm attention. 22 people froze. Several gasped. One child started to cry and was quickly hushed. Ravi stepped forward slowly, hands visible and empty. The Tigress's gaze locked on him. Recognition, he was certain of it, flickered in those eyes. "That's her," Priya whispered from behind him. "That's her," Ravi confirmed. They stood in tableau for long minutes, human grief and human gratitude on one side. Tiger consciousness, whatever that meant, however deep it ran, on the other. Between them, the memorial stone to 3 soldiers and one tribal elder who'd understood that honor transcends species. The Tigress made that soft, chuffing sound Ravi remembered from 6 months ago. Non-threatening, almost gentle. Then she did something that made his breath stop. She dipped her head, lowered it briefly, deliberately, then raised it again. The gesture looked impossibly like respect, like acknowledgement, like a salute between soldiers who'd completed a mission together. Several people in the group began crying openly. Park rangers present photographed the moment, documenting what wildlife behaviorists would later debate endlessly. Did the Tigress understand the gathering's significance? Or was this anthropomorphization of instinctive behavior? Ravi didn't care about academic debates. He knew what he'd witnessed, knew what he felt in his chest, as that magnificent creature acknowledged their presence, their grief, their gratitude. The tigress held position for another minute. Then she rose, stretched, and walked back into the forest. Slow, unhurried, supremely confident. She melted into green shadow and was gone. The group stood in stunned silence. Then everyone began talking at once. Did you see that? Did she really just... How did she know we were here? Oh my God, that was incredible. Priya turned to Ravi, tears streaming down her face. She came for him. She came to see us honor him. Maybe, maybe not. Maybe she'd come because humans were gathered in her territory and she was monitoring potential threats. Maybe she'd simply been passing through and coincidence aligned with human need for meaning. But Ravi had spent 6 months researching tiger cognition, had read every paper on spatial memory, problem-solving, learning through observation, had consulted with wildlife biologists who spoke carefully about emerging evidence of sophisticated intelligence in large predators. Tigers remembered locations across vast territories, learned from observation, adjusted behavior based on experience. Some researchers even cautiously suggested capacity for cross-species empathy, recognizing emotional states in other animals and responding with what appeared remarkably like compassion. What Ravi had experienced went beyond published studies. But it wasn't impossible. It was simply at the edge of what humans were willing to acknowledge about consciousness in other species. The tigress had seen him suffering and made a choice, had led him through her territory to evidence that would heal his suffering, had given him reason to live. And now, 6 months later, she'd appeared as humans gathered to honor the same soldiers she'd helped him find. Coincidence stretched thinner than reasonable belief allowed. Yes, Ravi told Priya, I think she came for him, for all 3 of them, and for us. That night, camping at the forest edge, Ravi sat alone looking at stars. His body ached from treatment and travel. His time was still limited. The cancer would eventually win. But not today, not this year. He had time. Time the tigress had given him by choosing mercy over indifference, by seeing suffering and deciding it mattered. He thought about what that meant, about consciousness and compassion and the vast distance between species that sometimes, impossibly, collapsed into understanding. About a tiger who taught him that wisdom didn't require human thought patterns, that mercy existed beyond human morality. She'd judged his worth and decided he deserved to live, had executed a mission with strategic precision to ensure that outcome, had saved 3 soldiers by saving the one man who could bring them home. How did a dying colonel thank a tiger for that? How did any human adequately honor what she'd given? Ravi had established a protection fund, legally securing her territory against development, ensuring prey populations remained stable, funding anti-poaching patrols. It felt inadequate, transactional, human solutions to a debt that transcended species and economics. But it was something. It was honor meeting honor across the unbridgeable gap that maybe wasn't as wide as humans assumed. Above him, stars wheeled in ancient patterns. Around him, the forest breathed with life that didn't need human understanding to be profound. And somewhere in that wilderness, a tigress walked her territory, carrying whatever thoughts tigers carry, demonstrating whatever grace exists in apex predators who choose compassion. Ravi closed his eyes and let gratitude wash through him. For time, for closure, for 3 soldiers finally at rest, for amber eyes that had seen his brokenness and decided it was worth healing. 3 weeks after the memorial gathering, Ravi received a package from the Wildlife Institute of India. Inside were camera trap photographs spanning 3 years, documentation of the tigress's movements through her territory. He spread the photos across his dining table, arranged them chronologically. The pattern was undeniable. The Tigress had been photographed near Gopal's memorial stone 47 times over 3 years. Not passing through, actually stopping, sitting, remaining for extended periods. In 12 photos, she was clearly investigating the stone itself, sniffing the carved letters, pouring gently at offerings left by occasional hikers who'd discovered the site. She'd been observing, learning, absorbing the significance humans placed on this location. Other photos showed her near the enemy position clearing, near the site where Amit's remains were found. She'd walked a circuit through these locations repeatedly, building what researchers called spatial memory, cognitive maps that allowed predators to navigate vast territories with precision. But Ravi saw something more in these images. He saw a mind mapping not just geography, but meaning. She'd connected locations to human behavior patterns, understood that certain places held emotional weight for the two-legged species sharing her forest. When she encountered him at that cliff, distressed, preparing for self-destruction, she'd accessed that cognitive map and made a strategic decision. She could guide this suffering human to locations that might heal him. She'd formulated a plan and executed it with precision that would impress any military commander. Wildlife biologists Ravi consulted were cautiously fascinated. Tigers possessed sophisticated spatial memory, yes. They learned through observation, demonstrated problem-solving abilities, showed individual personalities that suggested complex inner lives, but connecting abstract concepts, human distress, to historical evidence, to emotional healing, that pushed boundaries of documented behavior. That suggested consciousness operating at levels science was only beginning to acknowledge. "We're still learning what they're capable of," one researcher told him. "Every year we discover capacities we didn't think existed. Your experience is extraordinary, but not impossible, just rare or rarely witnessed." Ravi returned to the forest one final time in late December, alone. His oncologist had given him cautiously optimistic news. The cancer was in remission, might stay that way for years, might not. But he had time. He sat at Gopal's memorial stone, now officially protected and maintained by park authorities. A small plaque had been added, honoring Gopal's decades of solo guardianship. Another honoring the 3 soldiers. The forest finally acknowledged what one elder and one tigress had always known. Some deaths deserve commemoration regardless of bureaucratic convenience. The tigress appeared an hour before sunset. Same orange and black stripes, same powerful grace, same amber eyes that had seen his brokenness and decided it was worth healing. She sat 15 meters away, watching him with that calm attention that suggested assessment, recognition, something approaching, what humans called understanding. "Thank you," Ravi said softly. "I don't know if you understand words, but thank you for seeing me, for caring enough to help, for giving me back my soldiers and my life." The tigress made that low, chuffing sound, non-aggressive, almost gentle, the same sound she'd made 6 months ago when leading him through jungle toward impossible salvation. They sat together as light faded, human and tiger, predator and prey, 2 conscious beings separated by species but connected by something neither science nor language adequately described. Compassion, maybe, mercy, understanding that suffering transcends biology and healing requires courage regardless of who provides it. As darkness gathered, the tigress rose, stretched, looked at Ravi one final time with eyes that held depths he'd never fully comprehend. Then she walked into forest shadow and was gone. Ravi sat until stars emerged. Around him, the jungle breathed with life that didn't need human understanding to be profound. Monkeys calling, insects singing, the rustle of creatures beginning their nocturnal rounds. Vibrant, indifferent, except when it chose otherwise. If you've witnessed something extraordinary from an animal that changed how you see consciousness, share your story in the comments. If you believe wisdom exists beyond our species, write, "They understand more than we know." The author of this story spent 3 months researching tiger cognition, interviewing wildlife biologists, reviewing spatial memory studies. The science supports remarkable cognitive abilities in large predators, sophisticated memory, problem-solving, learning through observation, even evidence of cross-species empathy. But what Ravi experienced reaches beyond published papers into territory science is still mapping. It asks uncomfortable questions. What does consciousness look like when it doesn't use language? What does mercy mean when it has claws? How do we honor intelligence that operates through frameworks we barely comprehend? Colonel Ravi Mehta established the Nagarhole Tiger Protection Fund, legally securing the tigress's territory against development. He visits the memorial monthly. Sometimes he sees her tracks. Sometimes he feels watched from the forest. He never sees her again in person, but he carries her gift every day. 3 dog tags returned to families, 3 soldiers finally at rest, and the knowledge that a tiger judged his worth and decided he deserved to live. The tigress still patrols that territory. Park cameras capture her near the memorial stone. She's protected now. Local communities guard her like she guarded Ravi. 1 tiger, 1 soldier, 1 impossible act of grace. It changed 43 people who knew those 3 soldiers. Changed everyone who hears the story. Changed our understanding of what's possible when 2 species meet not as predator and prey, but as conscious beings who recognize suffering and choose, against all instinct, to help. That's not animal behavior driven by biology alone. That's something closer to wisdom. And it's teaching us what we're still too proud to ask. What else are they trying to tell us if we'd only learn to listen? Ravi visits the memorial every month. Sometimes he sees her tracks in the mud near the carved stone. Sometimes he feels eyes watching from dense undergrowth. Once he found fresh tiger prints pressed into the earth directly beside offerings families had left, flowers, incense, photographs of 3 young soldiers who finally came home. She's still keeping vigil, still honoring the dead in her own way, still demonstrating that consciousness and compassion don't require human brains, only awareness and the choice to act with mercy. She was a better commander than I ever was, Ravi says, touching the carved names on the memorial stone. She brought me home, she brought them home, she gave us all peace. His voice breaks, his hands shake. 4 years into remission now, borrowed time he spends protecting the forest that protected him, protecting the tigress who saved 3 soldiers by saving the 1 man who could recover them. In the trees above, birds settle into evening roosts. In the undergrowth, the forest prepares for night. And somewhere in that wilderness, a tigress walks her territory, carrying whatever thoughts tigers carry, demonstrating whatever grace exists in creatures we've barely begun to understand. She chose mercy when she could have chosen indifference. She chose to help when biology gave her no reason to care. That choice, that impossible, extraordinary choice, proves consciousness and compassion exist beyond our species, proves we're not as alone in wisdom as we've convinced ourselves. Some encounters change everything. Some tigers teach us that the boundaries we've drawn between human and animal, between instinct and choice, between them and us, maybe those boundaries were always more permeable than we wanted to admit. Maybe we've been asking the wrong questions all along. Not, are animals conscious, but how many forms can consciousness take? Not, do they think, but in how many languages does wisdom speak? A tiger answered those questions for 1 dying soldier, answered with action instead of words, with guidance instead of explanation, with grace that defied everything science said was possible. And in doing so, she proved that mercy has stripes, wisdom has claws, and sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected source, a predator who looks at suffering and decides it's worth healing.